improved school buildings that have sprouted up, including in some of the poorest parts of the state. Because again, I believe the quality of your education should not depend on your zip code or your parents' bank account. So I'm proud of the work I've done, and I will bring to the US Senate a commitment to represent everybody in Colorado, including folks in rural Colorado. It's an important question. And to Allison's point, I'll try my best to work with the other side, but I want to be candid. The reason that we were able to get so much done in the state house I led is in part because we found partners on the other side of the aisle. Even conservative Republicans who were willing to work with us on occasion when it came, for example, to fixing a flaw in the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or passing the bill I just mentioned, the BEST law. We named it BEST because we wanted to make it really hard for anybody to vote against. And I think only one guy did. The bill passed by a vote of about 99 to 1, or 99 to Bruce, as we like to say, in honor of a fellow named Doug Bruce, who was in the legislature at the time. Having said that, I will tell you, I'm no magician. I can't get Mitch McConnell to change his spots. Even if you send me to the US Senate, and I hope you will, you should not expect me to somehow transform Mitch McConnell into a pragmatist or anything other than what he proclaims himself to be, the grim reaper of the US Senate. You probably know that hundreds of bills have emerged from the US House only to die on Mitch McConnell's desk. A better solution, in my view, is to ditch Mitch. There's a hashtag for that. Replace him. If you have friends in Kentucky, I hope you'll encourage them to do that. Flip the Senate, kill the filibuster, and take action on all the proposals that are now languishing in the US Senate on an increase in the minimum wage, improvements to health care, immigration reform, reductions to gun violence, guarantees of election security, all of these proposals which are fundamental and should not be partisan. Democrats and Republicans outside of Washington agree on many of these issues. The trouble is we cannot dislodge Senator McConnell's opposition, and Cory Gardner and his Republican colleagues are unwilling to stand up to Senator McConnell and demand a vote on any of these proposals. That stands in our way. I want to make sure I do justice to the other questions that are coming in. An anonymous attendee asks, what happened to the Republicans that they no longer care about the people? What are you as a Democrat going to do to get our government back to running the country for the people? And I want to be clear to distinguish here the Republicans who are running the US Senate, like Mitch McConnell and the fellow in the White House named Donald Trump, from most people in America. Because the truth is, if you take any of these proposals, I'll just take gun violence as one life and death example. If you ask most Americans, shouldn't we have universal background checks? Not because we believe that will somehow eliminate the threat of any shooting, but at least reduce the death toll. Most Americans, more than 90% of Americans, including majorities of Republicans and gun owners, agree. So to answer your question, I think what we need is to break the logjam in the US Senate and appeal to the vast majority of Americans who share our values and our priorities and are willing to make progress. There's no magic solution here. The good news is there are enough Senate seats in play this year that we have a chance to flip the Senate, to hold the House, and obviously to replace Donald Trump in the White House. That's not enough. We need to kill the filibuster as well if we want to actually build a government that works for all of us, instead of allowing a minority of the US Senate to block action on any of these proposals. I'll just offer an analogy quickly. When I was the Speaker of the House, which was a great job, by the way, I didn't get to decide which bills got a hearing or a vote. The Colorado Constitution says every bill does. I believe the US Senate would do better to follow Colorado's model instead of allowing one man to act as a tyrant over the entire Senate. And let's be clear, it's not just Mitch McConnell at fault. All it would take is for a handful of women and men in the Senate Republican caucus today to demand a vote on any of these proposals. They won't do that. They haven't, at least, because they seem fearful of losing their jobs or crossing the president and being punished with a tweet storm. At some point, I think if you serve in public office, you have to ask why you're there. If your whole goal is to keep your job instead of to do your job, you should find a different job. And hopefully we'll provide some vocational counseling for Cory Gardner along those lines after November. Wendy is asking how it's possible that the federal government was able to take away the ventilators that Governor Polis's people had contracted to purchase. I was outraged to hear that happen recently. We were looking that up as well, Wendy. And it's deeply disturbing to me to see, as one of our colleagues found today, that there are simply not enough protective equipment, not enough ventilators, not enough supplies or resources for the folks who are in need, and enough protection for the healthcare workers who are asking. We're going to put that question and a series of other questions about the capacity of our healthcare system, both to respond to this pandemic and to provide care going forward, to a group of panelists that we're inviting to join us on Friday at noon. I just want to make this pitch now, and I'll repeat the invitation at the end. So this Friday at noon, we are conducting one in a weekly series of town hall meetings in which you're treated not just to my limited expertise, but by, in this case, to a group of healthcare experts. We did one just last week with a group of local officials from throughout the state, the week before with a group of infectious disease docs, and the week before that with a group of mental health professionals. So we've asked some people who actually run hospitals and are working in healthcare to join us for a panel this Friday at noon. And I hope if we don't get to all the questions today, we'll be able to put some of those questions to the people who are joining us on Facebook at Romanov 2020 and on Zoom Friday at noon. Today, Pedro is pointing out, Wisconsin's having their primary in the midst of a pandemic, having voters decide between their health and their right to vote. If you were in the Senate, what would you propose to protect voters in a pandemic? You're entirely right. Wisconsin should not be having its primary today. No one should have to pick between exercising their lawful right to vote and protecting their health or their lives. That's outrageous. To protect voters, I believe we need to do a few things. One, we should follow Colorado's lead and provide a universal mail-in ballot. We have a chance to do that across the country. We are doing that in Colorado. In June, for example, when the nomination in this race and other races other than president is decided on the June 30th primary, every registered voter in Colorado will get a ballot in the mail. Every registered voter in America deserves the same guarantee. If you think about it, even states other than Colorado that are picking US senators are making decisions that affect the whole country. So allowing voter suppression to take place or other forms of discrimination or forcing, as Pedro points out, people to pick between protecting their health and the right to vote is un-American, undemocratic, unacceptable, and I would argue unconstitutional. So I think having this guarantee in place as a matter of federal law rather than relying on the whims of a governor or a legislature or a county clerk makes sense as a matter of national policy. Amanda's asking again if we should abolish the filibuster. I believe we should. In Colorado's legislature, we don't have a device like that. It's not found in the United States Constitution. It doesn't serve a useful purpose. I believe we ought to allow an up or down vote on every bill. And if you're not willing to do that, at least require people who are threatening a filibuster to carry out their threat. Right now, all you have to do is signal your intent to start to talk a bill to death. You don't actually have to go through with it. I'd say you should. Why not see how long your lungs hold out or your bladder hold out or the American people hold out for the sight of that spectacle? I'd rather abolish the filibuster altogether. And when we flip the US Senate, we'll have a chance to do that. Walt's asking, I've heard you're on board with move to amend. Have you read the We the People Amendment? Can you rewrite it for less legalese? How deep is your understanding? So let me provide some context, and I'll defer, Walt, to your expertise here too. So the Supreme Court has made a series of decisions that really thwart democracy, in my view. The one that's gotten the most attention was a decision called Citizens United that came out, as you know, in 2010, essentially transforming corporations into people and giving them the rights to influence our elections through unlimited amounts of campaign spending. It's not only that decision that we need to fix by a constitutional amendment, like the proposal that Walt mentions and I support. It's also an earlier decision that came out in 1976. That was the year the court ruled in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo that money was essentially speech, meaning if you've got enough money, you can speak all you want. That creates really an uneven playing field. I've supported restrictions on campaign contributions, but that court ruling in Buckley says gazillionaires can spend unlimited amounts of their own money to buy public offices. It doesn't always work out that way, of course, as we've seen in both parties, but it creates a disparity between candidates of limited means and those who have unlimited resources. To me, we ought to make clear by a constitutional amendment that money isn't speech and that corporations aren't people. Unless we do that, I believe we will continue to see a system like ours that simply sells Senate seats to the highest bidder. That dramatically narrows the pool of candidates who ever run and the pool who win and warps the decisions they make as a result. I'll go back through the amendment to answer Walt's question and see if we can put it in plain language. Colorado, I'm using as an example here of a more transparent legislative process, has a rule not always followed that legislation be written in language that people can actually understand. Mike is asking, lots of Dems like Bernie Sanders or other candidates for the primary. I like to think Bernie could be the lion of the Senate. That was a great title, I think, bestowed on Ted Kennedy, among other folks. Elizabeth Warren has lots of great plans and ideas. Can you address how you would work with these candidates to get America back on the right track with a Democratic Congress and president? Yes, I can. Yes, we can, to borrow a phrase. Yeah, look, it's pretty clear to me that putting a new president in the White House is a necessary but not sufficient condition to put America back on track, to your point. We need Medicare for all. We need a Green New Deal. We need a reduction in gun violence. We need to repair this broken immigration system. We need all these priorities that cannot happen solely with a new president. I'll support the Democratic nominee for president no matter what, but it's not enough. We need to make sure that that president has allies both in the US House and in the US Senate, and leadership from those chambers. One of the most disappointing parts, not just disappointing, frustrating, infuriating, of watching the US Senate turn into a subsidiary of the White House is abandoning the tradition that we would have an independent branch of government. I used to teach American government in the community college system. I started at Red Rocks, ended up at Community College Aurora and Metro, at University of Colorado at Denver, taught a little bit at DU as well. And now I feel like I should go regrade my students' papers, because the ones who couldn't name all three branches of government, well, they deserve some dispensation, because we don't have three independent branches anymore. So I will agree with the president when I believe he, or I hope at some point soon she, is right. I'll disagree when the president is wrong. But I don't want to simply cede authority over every issue to the White House, even if it's a White House controlled by my own party. And if you've been following this race, you probably know that I'm not the darling of DC. I've got no trouble telling the leaders of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee or anybody else in charge of the Senate minority, or what I hope will be a majority, when I think they're wrong. And that's what voters deserve, in my view, and what they demand here in Colorado. Walt's also asking about foreign policy and says, as a Jew, how would you treat Palestine? Well, I'll tell you, I'm not just speaking as a Jewish American, but as an American and someone who believes in democracy and human rights. I happen to believe the Palestinian people deserve a homeland. I also believe that Israel has a right to exist and provide a homeland for its people. I support a two-state solution. I've made several trips to the Middle East and met with folks on both sides of that divide. I spent some time meeting with folks in the Palestinian territory, folks from the Israeli government, from different parties in the Israeli government. We also spent some time on one of my trips in Jordan and Egypt. It was a very dispiriting experience in some ways to see the paralysis that has set in. We'll share with you all just one hopeful sign. We visited a summer camp where little Israeli kids and Palestinian kids were playing together and laughing together and forming friendships, because no one had taught them to hate each other yet. So my hopes for a two-state solution and for peace in the Middle East in some ways rest on the next generation. I believe the US ought to facilitate that solution, but at the end, the security and peace and prosperity of that region can only come from its own people. Republican governors, Ken's asking, are taking advantage of declaring a state of emergency to ban abortions under the excuse that it's an elective procedure. What legislative solution would there be at the national level? So look, I believe a woman's right to control her own body is fundamental and should not depend on a governor or a legislature, or be sabotaged by an excuse like the one that Ken is referencing here. So to me, we ought to be codifying in federal law those protections. I happen to believe, and I've said this on other occasions, that if men could get pregnant, we would not be having this debate. I have a twin sister, and unlike me, my sister cannot take her autonomy for granted, because the men who run the country, supported in some cases by anti-choice women as well, have told her she doesn't have the right to decide. So to me, this is not an issue that ought to be left simply to the whims of the state. It ought to be a matter of federal policy. Amanda's asking, there's a truth in advertising law. Should we consider a truth in news law? Perhaps the channels cannot be labeled as news when opinion is the primetime topic. I don't know how you unite the country when 48% listens to unfactual vitriol daily. I'm wary. I don't know how you would actually go about enforcing a truth in news law. You're right that people are now divided among a variety of news stations, some of which are masquerading as news. I just sent out a tweet about this yesterday because the president's favorite news channel, the One American News Network, has peddled a whole series of conspiracy theories. If you watch John Oliver, and I hope you will, then you might have seen one of their commentators blame totalitarianism in America on transgender penguins. Another fellow on this network suggested that the ban on hairdressing that's in force under this pandemic is somehow making life in America equivalent to that in Hitler's Germany. These are outrageous opinions, and they might be comical if they weren't so dangerous and if they didn't command the almost undivided attention of the President of the United States. So I think we need to raise a generation of more perceptive consumers of news and information. I don't know that labeling is going to do the trick. Linda's asking me, what committees would you like to be a part of in Congress? I'll mention two where Cory Gardner now serves, and I think I could do a better job. One is the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. We haven't talked much yet about the climate crisis, but that crisis will continue when this pandemic ends. And I would like to replace Senator Gardner on that committee so that we can accelerate our transition to a clean energy economy, shift our reliance from fossil fuels to renewable energy, protect frontline communities and workers along the way, and put millions of Americans back to work. This is not just a New Deal moment in America, it will be a Green New Deal moment where we can take some inspiration from that earlier experience in American history and grow our economy. This is an opportunity that won't likely come around again, and I think we should seize it. I'm talking about the recovery so that we can make ourselves less susceptible to the sorts of storms and droughts and heat waves and wildfires and floods that the climate crisis is producing, and make the next pandemic less likely, because there's pretty good evidence that warmer temperatures are driving the spread of disease-carrying species. So that's one committee where I'd like to serve. I'd also like to serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I spent some time overseas. I taught in Central America after I finished college. I worked for an international development agency that has operations in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and Central America as well. And I have a deep interest in repairing some of the relationships that this president has so badly damaged, and recognizing that we're stronger together as part of a global community, whether it means combating the climate crisis or this pandemic or any of the other challenges we face. There's a longer question from Ken, and if I don't do justice to it, Ken promised to come back to it on our panel on Friday. Ken's asking about disturbing evidence that found as many as 1 in 5 COVID patients experiencing cardiac damage, heart failure, or death. Ken says that out of 416 hospitalized patients, 19% showed signs of heart damage, and they were more likely to succumb to the disease than those who didn't. I don't know, and I'm not sure there's a question here, but I will try to relay the question to the panel that we're producing either this Friday or to a future panel as well. So we'll try to hold that question. Thanks for asking, Ken. Linda says, if you don't play the game, how do you get things done and join committees that are important to you? I was joking about this during one of our debates during the Senate race in what seems like a lifetime ago, suggesting that Chuck Schumer might not give me the committees I want because he's not keen on my candidacy. But here's the thing, you probably know this. Whoever wins the Democratic nomination will find himself or herself with a lot more friends the next day. I know that some people are suggesting you got to nominate the guy who's got the most juice in Washington right now. That's ridiculous. The truth is, one, you're better off if you put somebody in this job who is independent of the party bosses and power brokers in DC. And two, you can be assured that the Democratic nominee will have all the financial support that he or she needs to win the general election against Cory Gardner. I'm not going to turn the Senate cloakroom into my own little private country club. I'd rather crash the joint. And when we win this race, I'll owe this seat to you, and not to the DSCC or Chuck Schumer or any other folks who've done so much to try to stifle this primary and turn this contest into a coronation. I recognize that Washington is a transactional town. I've had some success as a state legislator in bringing coalitions of people together, building those coalitions to get things done. And I will also tell you, when I was in the minority, I passed a lot of legislation by getting to know my Republican colleagues on issues that really crossed party lines, like mental health care. I think that's one of the keys to the success of any legislator, is if you can look past the party label and recognize that people share a set of values, that their constituents share a set of needs, and that, as one of my colleagues put it, your best friend on one bill might be your bitterest foe on the other. I think you can get some things done. At least that was my experience in the State House, and it's one of the reasons I got recognized as one of the most effective legislative leaders in America. Sue Ryden, speaking of state legislators, my friend from Aurora, former state representative, is asking me to tell a little bit more about my foreign policy experience, and I don't want to exaggerate this claim. It's true that after I finished college, I moved to Central America to teach English. I wouldn't call it foreign policy experience, although it was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I moved to Nicaragua in the wake of a very brutal civil war that our own government helped finance. And I have thought about that experience ever since, wondering how it is that a nation like ours can exacerbate problems in other parts of the world and then close the door when people flee problems that we've helped create. I think about that a lot today with respect to the climate crisis, because our pollution itself is contributing to the need that millions, and by some estimates more than 1 billion people, will have by the middle of this century unless we act now to flee their homes. You can't hardly blame someone for fleeing their home when it's burning, especially if you help set the fire. So I'd like us to be a partner and not a source of the problem. I've also had the chance, as Sue knows, to work in the field of international development for a group here called IDE. That organization, which stands for International Development Enterprises, helps small-scale farmers in other parts of the world increase their income by developing appropriate technology. In IDE's case, that means often foot-powered water pumps or drip irrigation systems, and then training local manufacturers to build the equipment, local technicians to repair it, and local retailers to sell it, creating a supply chain, in other words, in the private sector of those countries, and then getting out of the way. One of the lessons I draw is that the goal of international aid organizations ought not to be to make themselves indispensable, but rather obsolete, to serve as a catalyst for development that can continue when they're gone. There's a lot of stories I can share about what happens when that doesn't work. And I'm happy to share those thoughts if we have time today as well. What will your leadership style be? How will you bring the Dems together as well as the Rs? You know, on some of these issues, it's very hard to find common ground. We were asked earlier about abortion rights, and I had this conversation with a colleague of mine in the legislature on the other side of the aisle and the other side of this debate. I asked if he might be willing to join me in an effort to reduce the number of abortions by increasing support for contraception and sex education. He took the view that abstinence was the only solution. So we had a difficult time finding common ground on that issue. I did succeed, and I know that Sue did too, when she was in the State House, in meeting in the middle when it came to the math, when it came to investing in education or fixing a flaw in Tabor. Maybe I'll share with you that experience as just one example. When I became Speaker of the House, Colorado had fallen to 48th in the nation in job growth and 49th in public support for higher education. We were headed to the bottom. We still haven't made enough progress, but we found a Republican governor willing to work with us to acknowledge that the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or Tabor, was flawed, to build a coalition of 1,000 organizations across the state, to take that case to the voters, and to pass a measure called Referendum C back in 2005 that shored up support for schools and colleges and healthcare and human services. It remains, to this day, the only real change we've made to Tabor in the 28 years since that amendment was added to the Colorado Constitution. I wish I could tell you that it was my powers of persuasion that prompted a Republican governor to break with his own right wing and join us in that fight. I will tell you instead, though, it was the leaders from labor and business, students and parents and teachers, community activists who all came together to make that possible. And that's the only way I ever have found to get anything done. Sheldon's asking, can we invest more in the Green New Deal over the next few years? When the Democrats win, will they inherit an unprecedented national debt? So if you're facing a natural disaster or a depression or even a deep recession, it seems to me it makes sense to borrow money and, as you said, Sheldon, to invest because we need to goose this economy back to life. It's one of the reasons that I'm so excited to endorse this plan. I know that a lot of folks are taking a much more incremental approach even before this pandemic hit. They suggested that to combat the climate crisis, I've heard this now from some more timid Democrats and plenty of Republicans, that we should pursue incremental reform. We ran out the clock on that approach decades ago. I think we need bold change, both to combat the climate emergency and to help put this country back together when this pandemic ends. And as I suggested earlier, to make another pandemic less likely. So I hope we'll have a chance to do that. I think the most important color in America, I've said, is not really red or blue, it's green. It just so happens that Republicans like Cory Gardner and even Democrats in this race like John Hickenlooper oppose the Green New Deal and compare it to socialism, or in Hickenlooper's case, to Stalinism, which makes it very hard. These changes are going to be tough because we're up against the fossil fuel industry and a number of other political forces. So I don't want to minimize the challenge here, but it'll be impossible to pass plans like that if we have to fight Democrats who are themselves subsidized by the fossil fuel industry along the way. The Gracies are asking, how's my fundraising going? Will Gardner have a major advantage over whoever the Democratic candidate is, to only have a huge advantage of thousands of volunteers like you all to work hard to defeat Gardner? So I alluded to this earlier, and I'll make this request too. I know this is a miserable time to run for office, although the challenges we face as a campaign are nothing compared to the struggles that people are going through every day just to stay alive. So I don't want to exaggerate our difficulties. We do need to raise enough money to get on TV, to reach the voters who aren't on this conversation today. We received a number of donations in March, even throughout the course of this pandemic. If you want to chip into our campaign, you can do that by going to andrewromanoff.com. If you go to andrewromanoff.com/yes, you'll find a way to contribute. We haven't raised as much money as Governor Hickenlooper. I think that's clear. 80% of our contributions or so come from people in Colorado. 100%, by the way, come from humans, since we don't take any corporate cash. And I figure if a guy like me can win a race like this without all that corporate cash, our victory itself will send a shockwave to a town that needs one. And when we win, another candidate will take the same approach. And when she wins, somebody else will follow suit. Eventually, we can build a critical mass of candidates, representatives, and senators who owe their allegiance to their constituents, not to their corporate contributors, which is the way the system is supposed to work. I am not worried about raising money in the general election. On July 1st, if I'm the Democratic nominee, or whoever the Democratic nominee is, to Jim, at his point, that person, that Democrat, will have all sorts of friends across the country who will make it easy to compete. Not easy, this is still going to be work, but easy at least to compete with Cory Gardner's cash and his name recognition. I know there's some folks who take the view that Hick has a bigger, longer name, a better known name today. That's true. But when you get $20, $30 million of advertising, as the Democratic nominee will get in the general election, name recognition will not be a barrier at all. Andrew is asking about immigration reform in 2006. And we talked about this on a series of town hall meetings. And I've also written about this in the Denver Post. So I'll do justice to this question in the time that we have as well, and then encourage you to visit the op-ed that I wrote in the Denver Post as well. And maybe if Seth is listening, you all could post a link on the chat feature here. So here's what happened in 2006, and I take responsibility for this and have apologized as well, and I will here too. We were confronted with a dilemma. A group of anti-immigration advocates wanted to amend the state constitution to deny services from going to anybody in the state who was here without proper documentation, without exception for kids or health or safety. Only the services that were federally required, K-12 education and emergency medical care, would have continued. The governor of Colorado, a Republican named Bill Owens at the time, called the legislature back into special session in order to put that measure on the ballot. I worked with a group of immigration advocates to keep the measure off the ballot and out of the state constitution. We forged a compromise, which got blessed by those immigration advocates on both sides. We said, look, there are some services that are already off limits. They're still off limits. Cory Gardner, who was in the legislature at the time, said, well, you haven't actually taken anything away. And we thought he was right, because most of the services that these anti-immigration forces were up in arms about We're not actually going to anybody who was here without proper documentation to begin with. So we put that compromise on the governor's desk. He signed it into law. He was attacked by his own right wing for doing so. If I had that to do over again, and this is what I've written, what I've said, what I happen to believe, I would not have done that. I would not have passed a compromise. I would have passed nothing. The governor would have been able to call the legislature back into special session each time we adjourned, and that farce would have continued, I suspect, at which point we might have risked putting the initiative through citizens' petitions back on the ballot. In other words, the group that we were trying to keep off the ballot might have come back the next year and done so. That's a risk I wish we had taken rather than indulge the premise that was driving the constitutional amendment, which is a premise wholly false. Because the truth is, if you were here without proper documentation, and to this day, you weren't getting food stamps or welfare benefits or housing assistance. What I also happen to believe is that no state can enact immigration reform on its own. We need comprehensive federal reform. It's what I said in 2006 and ever since. And what I strongly believe is that we ought to provide a path to citizenship that doesn't take decades on end. I wouldn't be here if that path had not been opened to my mother and all four of my grandparents. I'm the son and the grandson of immigrants, and I'm glad we're here. I think we are better off as a country because we have welcomed people to contribute their talents. Our diversity is a source of strength. We don't always say that. We've allowed a president of the United States to demonize immigrants and refugees, to declare the country full, to describe asylum as a hoax, to suggest opening fire on migrant families. Donald Trump did so. And it's not a great surprise. When he descended the escalator in Trump Tower, Donald Trump declared the people of Mexico as rapists and criminals. He's using not just a dog whistle, in other words, but a bullhorn to embolden extremists and to fan the flames of hatred and violence. Replacing him and his allies in the US Senate who've allowed these policies to continue is fundamental. And for me, it's also very personal. I've shared this story with some of you, but I'll tell you now. I have a cousin who was adopted from Guatemala at a young age. When he was going to school in 2016, during the presidential election, his classmates taunted him. They said, when Donald Trump wins, you're going to have to go back where you came from. He went home in tears, asking his mother if that was true. And this president's rhetoric and his policies have been profoundly scarring, undermined our moral standing around the world, dishonored our heritage here at home. I will do everything I possibly can to fight that hatred and to enact the comprehensive immigration reform I believe we deserve. And I'm sorry that I made mistakes in 2006 by indulging in a compromise that I believe did more harm than good. Ken's asking, even though you have no control over super PAC advertising, many Democratic supporters found that Udall's one-note campaign based on fear essentially doomed his chances. Progressives I talked to were hugely disappointed in the fear-based advertising by PACs. Will you be forcefully stating you'll run a campaign that's positive and lets the people know who you are? Yeah, look, so we can go back through the Udall campaign if you want. I had a chance to talk with Mark, former Senator Udall, before I started this campaign. He sounded a lot more relaxed, by the way, than I did. And to me, I'm not going to disparage the personal character of Cory Gardner or anybody else. I believe his votes, his rhetoric, what he does in public office are fair game. There are clear differences between the two of us on these issues, just as there are differences in the Democratic primary. And there's a vast gulf between what Cory Gardner said in 2014 and what he's done ever since. When Cory Gardner beat Mark Udall 6 years ago, he promised to be a new kind of Republican. He said, when my party's wrong, I'll say so. If something's broken, I'll fix it. It was a great speech. It helped him get elected. It's been contradicted by virtually every vote he's cast since then. And I will not hesitate to point that out. But I don't want to spend the months that remain just pointing out all the places where Cory Gardner and Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump have gone wrong. It would take too long. I'd rather take Ken's advice and start to paint a picture of what life in America might look like if you put a different group of people in charge, how you build a clean energy economy, an economy that works for all of us, how you create healthcare for all and a strong system of public education and an immigration system that reflects our values. So yes, we're going to lay out a positive agenda, but we're not going to hesitate to point out the differences between Cory Gardner and me. From your campaign research, is Colorado a solid purple state? Linda asks, There's a lot of debate about this. It's certainly true in this race. I should have mentioned at the outset that a generic Democrat beats Cory Gardner by 11 points. I'll say that again. If the election were held today, a generic Democrat beats Cory Gardner by double digits. Now, obviously, I'm suggesting you nominate more than a generic Democrat. Put somebody in this seat who will bring the courage of your convictions to this fight. I think it's too soon to declare Colorado one color or the other. But when you have a Democratic governor, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, a majority of the Democrat congressional districts, and every other statewide office that I can think of in Democratic hands, it seems like we're well on the way to becoming bluer every day. It's also clear that unaffiliated voters represent the single largest bloc in the state, and we've got to make sure, as we're doing in this town hall and in every other piece of communication, that we reach out to them as well. Christine's asking about a universal basic income. And this question has been coming up a lot. I certainly give Andrew Yang credit for putting it on the table. I support the plans that are being offered now, not just a one-time payment of $1,200 a month, but a bigger payment that lasts the entirety of this pandemic. My policy team, by which I mean my friend Sergio and I, are trying to put together a plan for universal basic income that makes sense, because I think the diagnosis that Andrew Yang offered, I'm crediting him, although this proposal predates him as well, the diagnosis that suggests so many jobs, not just during this pandemic, but in this changing economy, will be lost to artificial intelligence, to automation, to other technological changes. I think that demands us to rethink public policy, and I'm open to that conversation and open to your thoughts. I didn't start this race, by the way, with the assumption that I had an answer to every question. So I'm doing my best to let you ask me anything and to answer anything, but if you've got some ideas or want to point us to a policy document, I'll turn this into a full employment act for Sergio. Just email Sergio@andrewromanoff.com. Sergio@andrewromanoff.com. Sorry, Sergio, if you're listening. Your inbox will be filled, I hope. If elected, Jorge's asking, how will you work with other Republican senators to work on a path towards citizenship? And I mentioned this at the outset, but not at the outset, but in the course of an earlier conversation. So I happen to believe if you put a proposal for comprehensive immigration reform on the floor of the US Senate, it would pass. There are enough Republicans, at least in theory, who have signaled their support. Now, they will not demand a vote for Mitch McConnell, so there will be no such proposal on the floor of the Senate today or tomorrow or any time that he's in charge or that his team holds a majority. But when it comes to a swifter path to citizenship, protection both for people who now have only temporary protected status or TPS and deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA, a Dream and Promise Act that codifies those protections so that they no longer hinge on the whims of a president or a future Congress, putting those protections into law today is essential. And one of the consequences of this fight now, I think you can see that's going on in the US Senate, is a recognition that disasters are taking a disparate toll on different populations. We could talk about that as well. But to my mind, the folks who are doing everything they possibly can to contribute to the country, as the vast majority of immigrants are, deserve not just legal status, but citizenship. Should not be forced to labor in the shadows or to fear a knock on the door or to watch their families torn apart or their children caged. That's immoral. And it is, I think, a stain on America to watch not just a president, but his allies in Congress perpetuate policies like those. I'll work to answer your question with any senator on any side of the aisle who shares that goal. It's a priority for me, and I think it is, or should be at least for all of us. One other point I'll make, despite the president's rhetoric, you probably know, if you're following this campaign, I've made this point often, that immigrants are committing crimes at lower rates than native-born Americans. So the president's continued efforts to demonize our neighbors is at odds not just with morality, but with basic math, one of the many subjects that he has flunked. I know we're nearing the end of our time, so I want to just share a couple other thoughts with you in the time that we have left. We've had a few questions that have come up throughout this campaign on healthcare. And I've spent the last 4 years as the president of a group called Mental Health Colorado, fighting sometimes insurance companies on behalf of families who face mental illness or drug addiction, which is to say pretty much every family in America. This is a club no one wants to join. My own family suffered a devastating loss 5 years ago when my kid cousin Melissa died by suicide. But I know that we're not alone. I've met so many families across the state who have lost their homes, their savings, their jobs, their loved ones to a set of diseases that we can treat. So to me, the priority has to be, as we build a healthcare system that works for all of us, including protection for mental health and substance use services, by which I mean both treatment and prevention. And I don't believe those services or any healthcare services ought to depend on the generosity of an employer or whether you have a job at all. I know we've conducted an experiment in America for the last 80 years or so that tethers insurance to employment. It's not a law of nature, it's an accident of history. In the 1940s, the government made two decisions that really shaped this nexus. The government froze wages and then made benefits tax-free. That's really where this link took hold. Now we've seen 10 million Americans lose their jobs, and that perhaps a third of them lose their insurance. By some estimates, the unemployment rate, when this pandemic is at its worst, will cross 32%. So you'll have millions of Americans without employment-based insurance. I have not met a lot of folks who tell me, don't touch my Cigna or my Aetna or my United. People are attached to their providers, to the doctors, the nurses, the specialists, to the benefits that come with it. I believe we could build a better model. And I suggested at the outset that we do that by lowering the age of Medicare eligibility to 0. I know that sounds like a radical plan in the American context, but it's really not. If you go back to 1965, when LBJ signed Medicare and Medicaid into law, you'd find a lot of the proponents were not proposing to declare victory with coverage that extended only to seniors. Thank goodness. If you get to be 65, you've got coverage that, at least by law, now cannot be taken away. But what if you're 64? I met a woman in Greeley a couple months back who needed spinal surgery, extremely expensive, couldn't afford it, and decided to roll the dice. She said, I'm going to wait a year. She was 64. When she turned 65, she enrolled in Medicare. She had the surgery performed, and she survived. She walked into the brew pub in Greeley where we were holding this conversation and told me what had happened. And I'm glad she's alive today. But what if she had had to wait longer? What if she had been 63 or 62? Or for that matter, what if she had been 26? That turns out to be an important number too, because it's the age at which you become too old to stay on your parents' plan. This system that makes your coverage dependent on your age or your income, your employment, your insurance company, is not rational or efficient. And if you don't believe me, just ask yourself this question. How many politicians do you suppose outside of the United States tonight are campaigning on a promise to bring their constituents American-style health insurance? It's not a winning argument. And it's not that we don't have some of the best doctors and nurses and healthcare facilities in the world. We do. It's just the system itself is not the most efficient. And at some point, I believe this debate will no longer be political. It'll simply be mathematical because we're going bankrupt. Healthcare costs represent, even before this pandemic struck, the single biggest source of bankruptcy in the United States, driving 500,000 families into bankruptcy each year and costing 35,000 Americans their lives. That's the annual death toll associated with the high cost of medical care in the richest nation on the face of the earth. So one of the lessons I take from this pandemic is that leaving 28 million Americans uninsured or 44 million underinsured is a bad strategy for anybody. And I hope that we'll be able to create a system that covers everyone, that provides a package of benefits that is robust enough to make private insurance unnecessary. I think we can get from here to there. I certainly believe a public option would be better than the status quo. We've gotten this question a lot too. It's one of the reasons that I endorsed that plan as well 10 years ago when the Affordable Care Act debate began. Part of the challenge there, as the health economists have explained to me, is that the people most likely to sign up for a public option will be sicker and more expensive to treat. So the economics of that pool don't make it terribly competitive. The whole point of insurance is to spread the risk. That's why I think a single universal risk pool makes sense. And I believe we can get there, but only if we elect folks with the courage to try. What we've seen too often, I think, even on the part of Democrats, is to begin these negotiations at the 50-yard line, to negotiate with ourselves, to compromise before the debate ever begins, and then somehow to find ourselves surprised when the other team isn't willing to play ball. Look, I welcome ideas from any side of the aisle when it comes to improving the quality of care, expanding coverage, or reducing costs. I wish that Cory Gardner had been serious when he said he had a plan to repair and replace Obamacare, as he's been trying to do along with the rest of his party for the last 10 years. But it's pretty obvious there is no replacement plan, and that's not acceptable. I do not want to return Americans to the days in which insurance companies could discriminate against us on the basis of pre-existing conditions, or stop us from expanding Medicaid, or force kids off of their parents' plans. I'm glad that we've made progress. I don't want to shortchange that over the last 10 years. I just believe the Affordable Care Act is still not affordable enough. And I hope that we'll take some inspiration from the spirit of the New Deal to rethink some of these proposals. And that's the last thing I'll say in the time that we have left. And again, I'll invite you to join us again on Friday at noon for a more extended conversation. It would be a mistake, in my view, simply to return to business as usual. Surviving this pandemic, saving lives, protecting ourselves, rebuilding our economy, those are essential priorities. And I share them. I'll do everything I can in or out of office to make that happen. But I think we ought to examine the inequities that predated this pandemic and make it not an equal opportunity killer. It's true that all of us are at risk, but it's also true that we've seen a disproportionate impact on particular communities, both because they don't have as much coverage and in some cases, not as much wealth. We'll have this conversation, I hope, as well on Friday. I invite you to join us to share your thoughts. I hope I've done justice to most of your questions. And now I realize that there's a couple more coming in. Initial reports suggest, Ken points out, that healthcare insurance companies will be lining up to be part of the next congressional bailout, which is why Ken says, and I agree, that we need Medicare for all now. It is curious to me as well that some of the Republicans who are embracing Medicare, and even some Democrats too, are confining their support to a single disease. So Medicare for COVID, we ought to have Medicare for all people, for all conditions. And we ought to find, I think, in turn, that it'll be cheaper to provide that coverage, as other nations have found, half the price in some cases, in the OECD average, than what Americans are paying now. So we're not going to have time to explore the entire health insurance debate, but it's part of the conversations that we have in mind. If you have suggestions for other topics, other panels, other ways that we can use our time, I hope that you'll share them. I know this is an extraordinarily difficult moment for everyone. I'm inspired every day by the risks that so many of our, not only healthcare providers, but food workers and maintenance employees are taking to keep us all safe and healthy. I appreciate your courage. I know we'll get through this crisis together. And I want to say thank you for sharing your time with me again. Hope you'll join us Friday at noon on Facebook and on Zoom. Have a great day.